It was just another Saturday morning, until four little girls froze in their tracks. That tattoo, that exact tattoo, Ryan had seen it inked onto his wife's skin 11 years ago.
What happened next would unravel a mystery 3 years in the making and change this family forever.
If you have ever loved someone so much that losing them felt like losing your own heartbeat, then stay with me until the very end of this video, because what happened to Ryan Mitchell on an ordinary Saturday morning at a small-town farmer's market will change the way you think about hope forever. If stories like this move you, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel, because we are just getting started, and trust me, you do not want to miss where this one goes. Ryan Mitchell was 37 years old, and for the last 3 years he had been raising 4 little girls completely on his own. Emma was 12, sharp-tongued, and fiercely protective of her sisters. Chloe was 10, quiet, and always sketching in a notebook she never let anyone see. Lily was 8, the family's self-appointed peacekeeper. And Sophie, the youngest at 6, still believed with all her heart that her mother was coming home one day. Ryan never had the courage to tell her otherwise, because the truth was, he was not entirely sure himself. 3 years earlier, his wife Sarah had disappeared during a flash flood that swept through the valley outside their small town of Cedar Falls. She had been driving home from her sister's house when the bridge over Miller's and Creek collapsed under the rushing water. Search teams worked for 2 weeks. They found her car 3 miles downstream, crushed against a boulder, driver's door open, seatbelt cut. They never found her body. The county coroner eventually issued a death certificate based on circumstantial evidence. But Ryan had never been given the one thing every grieving person needs to actually start: grieving proof. And so, for 3 years, he lived in a strange, aching limbo, raising 4 daughters who had inherited their mother's laugh, her stubbornness, and her habit of humming while she cooked, without ever truly being able to say goodbye to her. He rebuilt his life the only way he knew how, one exhausting day at a time. He worked as a contractor, building decks and remodeling kitchens, taking jobs that let him be home by the time the school bus dropped the girls off. His mother, Diane, drove in from 2 towns over every Wednesday to help with laundry and homework. His younger brother Mark showed up unannounced most Sundays, with a box of donuts and just enough dry humor to make the house feel less quiet than it actually was. And his neighbor, Mia Torres, a single mother herself, had become the kind of friend who didn't need to be asked before she showed up with a casserole on the hardest nights. Between the 4 of them, Ryan had managed to keep his daughters fed, loved, and mostly whole. But some part of him, the part that still reached for the other side of the bed at 3 in the morning, had never stopped waiting. The early months had nearly broken him. There had been a stretch, right after the funeral, that wasn't really a funeral, because there was no body to bury, when Ryan had come dangerously close to losing the business he had spent a decade building, missing job after job because he could not make himself leave the house, could not make himself explain to 4 small girls why their mother's coat still hung by the door. It was Mia who had shown up on the worst of those mornings, taken one look at the unpaid bills spread across the kitchen table, and simply started making phone calls on his behalf, rescheduling clients, arranging carpool, buying groceries with money she pretended he had already paid her back for. It was Diane who had sat with Sophie every night for 2 months straight, singing every lullaby she could remember because Ryan couldn't carpool, bring himself to sing the one Sarah used to. Slowly, unglamorously, they had clawed their way back to something resembling normal. Emma had become fiercely guarded in the process, quick to change the subject whenever a teacher mentioned Mother's Day crafts, quick to remind her sisters, a little too sharply, that Dad already had enough to worry about. Chloe had stopped talking about her feelings altogether and started drawing them instead, filling notebook after notebook with sketches she never showed anyone, not even Ryan. It was a fragile, hard-won piece, the kind built by people who had learned to survive rather than truly heal, and none of them, least of all Ryan, had any idea it was about to be tested all over again. That Saturday started like any other. Ryan had promised the girls a trip to the Cedar Falls farmers market, the same one Sarah used to be. Drag them to every weekend for fresh peaches and honey from the Henderson stand. It was one of the few traditions he had kept alive, mostly because Sophie still asked for it by name. The morning was warm, golden light spilling over the rows of vendor tents, the smell of kettle corn and fresh bread drifting through the crowd. Emma walked ahead with her hands jammed in her jacket pockets. Chloe trailed behind, sketching the awnings, and Lily held tight to Sophie's hand, weaving between strangers with the practiced calm of a girl who had done this 100 times. It happened near the flower stand. A woman was kneeling down, helping an elderly vendor gather scattered bundles of sunflowers that had toppled in the breeze. Her sleeve rode up as she reached for a fallen bunch, and there, on the inside of her left wrist, was a small tattoo, a compass rose, its 4 points radiating outward, each one tipped with a tiny 5-pointed star. It was not a common design. Ryan knew that better than anyone alive, because he had watched the tattoo artist ink the exact same design onto Sarah's wrist. 11 years earlier, 1 star for each daughter they had planned to have, drawn the week after they learned Sophie was on the way. Sophie saw it first. She stopped walking so suddenly that Lily nearly tripped over her. "Daddy," she said, her small voice cutting through the noise of the market like a struck bell. "That lady has Mommy's tattoo." Ryan laughed it off at first, the nervous kind of laugh a parent gives when a child says something too big for a public sidewalk. But then Emma stopped too, and Chloe, and one by one all 4 of his daughters were standing perfectly still, staring at a stranger's wrist. "Our mom has a tattoo just like yours," Emma said. Quieter than Sophie, but somehow heavier. Ryan felt something cold move through his chest. He looked at the woman properly for the first time. She was maybe 35, with dark blonde hair, pulled back in a loose braid, wearing a soft green cardigan over a floral dress and a delicate gold necklace. The kind of effortlessly put-together look that turned heads without trying. The kind of quiet elegance that made her seem entirely out of place, kneeling in the dirt among scattered sunflowers, and yet somehow completely at ease there too. Her eyes were the same shade of hazel green Ryan had spent a decade memorizing. Her jaw had the same slight upward tilt when she was startled, which she now was, straightening up and stepping back instinctively from 4 children she had never met. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice cracked something loose in Ryan's memory, though he told himself immediately that grief could do strange things to a person's ears. "Do we know each other?" Ryan opened his mouth and nothing came out. Up close, the resemblance was not exact. This woman's nose was slightly different. There was a faint scar above her left eyebrow that Sarah never had, and her hair was shorter, lighter. But the eyes, the tattoo, the way she tilted her head when she was confused. He finally managed to introduce himself, and she told him her name was Grace Ellison, that she had moved to Cedar Falls about 8 months ago, that she worked at the county library, and that she genuinely had no idea why 4 little girls were looking at her like she had stepped out of a dream. She was kind about it, gentle even, crouching down to Sophie's level and asking about the tattoo, with the patient curiosity of someone who worked with children often. She told them she had gotten it years ago. After a difficult period in her life, she preferred not to discuss with strangers, though something flickered across her face when she said it, something that looked almost like uncertainty about her own answer. Ryan should have walked away. Every rational part of his brain told him this was nothing more than a coincidence. A similar tattoo design, a stranger with kind eyes, who happened to remind a grieving man and his daughters of someone they missed desperately. But that night, after the girls were asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with an old photo album and stared at a picture of Sarah, laughing on their porch, wrist raised to shield her eyes from the sun, tattoo clearly visible, and he could not make the feeling in his chest go away. The next morning, Sophie asked if they could go back to the market to see the lady, and against every ounce of his better judgment, Ryan said yes. Over the following weeks, what began as a strange coincidence slowly became something Ryan could not stop pulling at. Like a loose thread on a sweater he knew he shouldn't touch. He started visiting the library on the pretense of taking the girls to story hour, and Grace, for her part, seemed to genuinely enjoy the girls' company, especially Sophie's endless questions and Chloe's shy offers to show her sketchbook. Ryan learned that Grace had arrived in Cedar Falls with almost nothing. a small bag of belongings, a modest inheritance from a great aunt she barely remembered, and a set of memories that, she eventually admitted to him one evening over coffee, did not go back further than about 3 years. She told him, carefully, like someone confessing something she was ashamed of, that she had woken up in a hospital in a town 2 states away, pulled from a river by a fisherman, with no identification, severe hypothermia, and a head injury that doctors said had likely caused retrograde amnesia. She had no family come looking for her. No missing persons report matched her description closely enough to be confirmed. The hospital eventually helped her build a new identity, and she had spent the last 3 years trying to construct a life out of fragments, chasing half-formed feelings that never quite resolved into memories. She told Ryan this like it was a sad but settled fact of her life, something she had made peace with. Ryan sat across from her, his coffee going cold, doing the math in his head, over and over. A river. 3 years ago. Hypothermia. No identification. He did not sleep that night. The next morning, he called Mark before he even called his mother, because he needed someone to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. Mark listened to the entire story in silence, and then said quietly, "Ryan, you need to be careful here. You could be building a fantasy out of a stranger's face, and if you're wrong, you are going to break those girls' hearts all over again." He wasn't wrong to worry. Diane, when Ryan finally told her, was even more direct, reminding him through tears that she had watched her son bury an empty casket and could not bear to watch him dig up that grief for whose nothing. Even Mia, usually his biggest cheerleader, urged caution, gently pointing out that trauma made people see what they desperately needed to see. Ryan understood every warning. He agreed with all of them, out loud, but quietly, in the part of himself that had never stopped waiting by the window. He could not let it go. He went to Detective Alvarez, the officer who had led the original search for Sarah 3 years earlier, and laid out everything: the tattoo, the timeline, the river, the amnesia. Alvarez, to her credit, did not dismiss him, though she warned him plainly that coincidences like this rarely ended the way people hoped. Still, she agreed to help, quietly requesting Grace's hospital intake records from 3 years prior and cross-referencing them with the flood timeline and the location where Sarah's mark had been recovered downstream. The river that had swept Sarah away fed into a larger tributary that, 200 miles later, passed directly through the town where an unidentified woman had been pulled from the water, unconscious, 4 days after the Cedar Falls flood. Alvarez cautioned him, gently but firmly, that this would not be the first time hope had led the Mitchell case astray. 18 months earlier, a tip had come in from a trucker who swore he'd seen a woman matching Sarah's description at a rest stop 3 states away, and Ryan had driven through the night on nothing but adrenaline and grief, only to find a stranger who barely resembled his wife at all, and to drive home in silence as the sun came up, unable to explain to 4 hopeful little girls why Mommy hadn't come home with him after all. Alvarez had been the one to take that call too, and she had watched what it did to him afterward. The way he stopped answering his phone for a week, the way he started locking the tip line notifications away in a folder he never opened again. She did not want to watch that happen twice. But even she couldn't ignore how precisely the timeline lined up this time. The flood, the river, the 4 days, the tattoo that was not some vague resemblance, but an exact, unusual, custom design. She agreed to help on one condition: that Ryan tell no one, not even his mother, until there was something concrete to tell. When Ryan brought this to Grace, gently, carefully, over another cup of coffee that neither of them touched, she went very still. He watched something behind her eyes struggle against itself. A door she had never dared to push on suddenly creaking open. She agreed, hands trembling, to a DNA test, though she admitted she was terrified of what it might say. Terrified of a truth that could either hand her back an entire life or confirm that the aching, formless homesickness she had felt for 3 years, the sense of missing something she could never name, was permanent and unanswerable. Ryan didn't tell the girls. He couldn't, not until he knew for certain, not after everything they had already lost. The 2 weeks waiting for results were the longest of Ryan's life, longer even than the 2 weeks of the original search. He kept working, kept making school lunches and driving carpool, and tucking his daughters into bed. But every quiet moment folded in on itself, tightening around a single unbearable question. Grace, for her part, began having what she described as flashes rather than memories. The smell of a particular soap, the sound of a child's laugh that made her chest ache without explanation, a half-remembered lullaby she found herself humming while shelving library books, unable to recall where she had learned it. Ryan recognized it instantly when she hummed it for him one afternoon. It was the same lullaby Sarah used to sing to Sophie every single night. The call from Detective Alvarez came on a Thursday afternoon while Ryan was replacing a cabinet hinge in a client's kitchen. He nearly dropped his phone. The DNA match was conclusive. Grace Ellison was Sarah Mitchell. She had survived the flood, been swept miles downstream, suffered a severe head injury, and, in the chaos and confusion of an unidentified Jane Doe with no working memory, had simply fallen through the cracks of a system never built to reunite a woman with a life she could no longer describe. Ryan sat down on the client's kitchen floor and cried for the first time in 3 years. Not from grief this time, but from something that felt almost too enormous to hold. Telling the girls was its own kind of terrifying. Ryan gathered all 4 of them in the living room, Sarah waiting nervously in the car outside, because none of them had agreed yet on how, or even whether, to do this all at once. He knelt down in front of his daughters and told them, as gently and honestly as he knew how, that the lady from the farmer's market, the one with their mother's tattoo, was their mother. Emma's face crumpled first, disbelief chasing something rawer underneath it. Chloe went completely silent, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Lily started crying before she understood why. And Sophie, sweet stubborn Sophie, who had never once stopped believing, simply said, "I told you she was coming home." The reunion in the driveway that afternoon was not the tidy, cinematic moment any of them might have imagined. Sarah, still relearning her own name, still uncertain of half her own history, dropped to her knees on the concrete and was immediately swallowed by 4 small bodies at once. All of them crying, all of them talking over each other, Sophie refusing to let go of her hand for nearly an hour. Sarah did not remember most of their childhoods. She did not remember her wedding day, or the hospital room where each of her daughters was born, or the porch where Ryan had taken that photograph he had stared at every night for 3 years. But she remembered the lullaby. She remembered, somehow, the exact way Sophie's hand felt in hers, and she cried harder than any of them, grieving 3 years she could never get back, even as she held the family she had, against every statistical likelihood, found her way home to. The months that followed were not simple. There was therapy, for all of them, and long stretches where Sarah grieved a version of herself she was not sure she would ever fully recover, and days when Emma, in particular, struggled with an anger she didn't fully understand toward a mother who hadn't chosen to leave but had left all the same. Ryan and Sarah did not simply slide back into the marriage they'd had 3 years earlier. They had to learn each other again, slowly, patiently, the way you rebuild a house from a foundation that is still standing, but has weathered a storm no one could have predicted. Diane cried for a week straight, alternating between disbelief and gratitude. Mark showed up with donuts, and for once, no jokes. Just a long hug for his brother and his sister-in-law. Mia stood in the doorway of the Mitchell house the day Sarah moved back in, and simply said, "I have never in my life been so happy to be wrong." It has been almost a year now since that Saturday morning at the farmer's market. Sarah still doesn't remember everything, and she has come to accept that some pieces of her past may never fully return. The wedding day is still a blank page. The years of building the contracting business alongside Ryan, the late nights over a shared laptop tracking invoices, the argument they've lauded had the week before the flood, over a paint color for the nursery that never got finished, none of it has come back. And Sarah has stopped waiting for it to. What she has instead, she says, is something almost better. The chance to fall in love with her own family twice. She remembers her daughter's laughter now. Remembers the sound of Ryan's voice reading bedtime stories through the wall. Remembers, day by day, what it means to be Sarah Mitchell again, instead of a woman built entirely out of fragments in a life that never quite fit. Emma, who struggled the longest with an anger she couldn't name, finally broke down one evening, months into their new normal, and admitted to her mother that part of her had been afraid to love her again, afraid that if she let herself hope too hard a second time, the universe would find some new way to take it back. Sarah didn't try to fix that fear with reassurances she couldn't guarantee. She simply sat with her oldest daughter on the porch steps, the same porch from the photograph Ryan had stared at for 3 years, and told her it was allowed to take as long as it needed. Chloe eventually showed her mother the sketchbooks, 3 years worth of drawings that turned out to be, almost every single one, some version of a woman with a compass tattoo on her wrist, drawn from memory, drawn from longing, drawn by a little girl who had never stopped trying to picture her mother's face. Sarah cried for an hour over that sketchbook, and then asked if she could keep it. Diane visits every Wednesday still, though now she spends half the visit simply sitting across the kitchen table from her daughter-in-law, relearning her the way you'd reread a favorite book after years apart, finding new lines in it you hadn't noticed before. Mark's jokes came back eventually, along with the donuts, and Mia likes to say that the entire street throws a small, unofficial celebration every year on the anniversary of the day Sarah came home, though everyone insists it's just a barbecue. Sophie still tells anyone who will listen that she always knew her mother was coming home, and maybe she was the only one among them brave enough to keep believing it, without ever once needing proof. If there is one thing this family's story proves, it is that hope is rarely loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like 4 little girls stopping in their tracks at a flower stand, staring at a stranger's wrist, refusing to let go of a truth their hearts recognized long before anyone's but a mind was ready to believe it. Sometimes it looks like a father who kept a photograph on his nightstand for 3 years instead of putting it away, or a detective willing to make one more phone call she didn't have to make, or a woman who spent 3 years feeling homesick for a life she couldn't name, and never once stopped listening to that feeling. And sometimes, against every reasonable expectation, that stubborn, quiet hope is exactly what brings someone all the way home.